Well, my practice has, for the past 45 years, been primarily performance. But the performances that I've made in that period of time, that span of time, have been in very different sorts of manifestations. So I would summarize by saying that the early works that I made in the 1970s were very rooted in object making, and the performance as an ephemeral event was a way of showing those objects, often worn by the performers or broken in the performance, a way of transforming the object in the kinetic moment of the live event. If I didn't perform in my early work, I mainly directed and devised the performances and others performed in them. And then towards the 80s, I started to perform myself, and these performances, much to my surprise, were solos and also involved language, which had not been something that I was particularly taken with earlier.
When I first arrived in Vancouver, I was told a lot about the sorts of views I was going to see. Well, I expect some of you have noticed it's been raining rather a lot in the past week. And really, I haven't seen very much of the outdoors at all. I've been in here all the time, leading really a very interior sort of life.
And almost by accident, once I was asked to give a performance that was going to be a collaboration in New York, but ended up, the others dropped out, and I ended up doing it by myself, and it was an improvised monologue. It lasted about 70 minutes. I have no idea what I said, but people laughed, and it was intoxicating and liberating. And they became sort of scripts, and I then became more interested in writing and the script being developed. And I also became more interested in having co-performers in my work. And so therefore, during the late 80s and 90s, those performances involved very large companies of co-performers, all usually having quite special skills, acrobats, dancers, singers. And they were presented on proscenium stages, so they used all the traditions and conventions of the proscenium stage, a sort of Renaissance machine. There's a form of evidence that's still being communicated inside the archive. And what's important to me about the archive is it contains the vestige of the idea, even if it's the ephemeral moment where all those things are in the air together, circulating in this erotic moment in the arena of the performance. The actual kernel of the idea is vested in the archive, whether that's in terms of scores or scripts, or research into particular elements, or storyboards that I would often make. There's also the element of documentation that exists in the archive in terms of still images and film and video of the performances, which are things in their own right, but also in juxtaposition with each other. Also can give rise to a sense of the event, the context that the event happened in, and the evidence of the idea. But also in collaboration with, say, curators. In recent years, there have been a number of shows that I've made where curators have come and we've spent time with my archive and we've imagined how to show that work in the present. More recently, the show A Premonition of the Act at the Camden Arts Centre. Also looked at a body of work that I've made with glass and acrobatics, and those are exploring an ephemeral performance form in exhibition form. So it's a different way of that work being seen. I'm thinking of when I revisited Quadrille, the performance with 6 dancers dressed as horses presented in a dressage arena. It was very important that something about the juxtaposition of all those elements of that performance, the film that existed of it, the objects, that they somehow gave a sense of what the event was. I think with performance, for me, it can so often be shown in a way that it's bereft of its context. And it's the context that's all. Sometimes it seems that there was a period of time, particularly there was a tension between whether the work was performance or live art or whether it was theatre. I never understood that split. If you're interested in theatre or in theatrical representation, and you want to make a work in a theatre, you could view it as being a site-specific performance inside a theatre, or you could view it as a piece of theatre. For me, there was a period of time, perhaps in the late 70s, early 80s, when it felt that if I was to remain within an art-only context for my work, I could expect to do something maybe once a year, whilst there was this other convention that expected you to do something 7 days a week and maybe 2 matinees, which was theatre.
Perhaps you may be interested more in my second service. It is a good lashing of these lashes.
A lot of my work has been about it's ephemeral itself, and it's about been addressing its own ephemerality. Even sort of works as early as Berlin, made in 1976, was addressing its own ephemerality as it came into being. And I suppose that is in parallel with my archive, that concern about its ephemerality, but also its conversely, its materiality in terms of the ideas that are present in it. I would say that there's this particular line in a performance I made in '94 called Tantamount Espérance, where one of the characters says, "Evidence is no guarantee of remembering or being remembered, but the object needs an advocate. It cannot argue unless it is noticed." And so if nobody notices what's in the archive, it is absolutely meaningless. But if they notice and they bring a certain sensibility to how they view what's in it, then the ideas can still be present. There is something infinitely interesting to me about objects on the verge of going back to nothingness. And that was something that I explored in my very first performance. I spent a year making the objects for it. Out of porcelain, and then the objects were actually broken in the performance. So it's also something I've returned to with glass, going back to glass at its most filigree-like form. And I guess it's also my interest in things like the lyrics, the songs, the word being sung, is the word is expressed and then goes back into nothing. And I suppose it's that sort of that oscillation between materiality and immateriality that has been a constant through my work. But also my archive includes a large number of objects that have been actually present in performances, and they carry a trope of the event in the aura of the object. And it's been very interesting to see that they're often made of organic materials, particularly the early work out of horsehair, fur, leaves, as in the skirt that I made for the performance Berlin, the muff carried by Sally Potter in Berlin is made of fur. Been very interesting to sort of look at them in terms of how they can actually be conserved and why one should do that and to what degree. The horse as a trope has been a recurrent thing that has reoccurred in my work across decades, in fact. So starting with performance like Quadrille, made in 1975, through to the first time I worked with a horse on stage, which was in 1992 with a performance called My Mathematics. And it was something I just decided that I had always wanted to try and attempt this improvised performance with a horse, an animal. That performance was concerned with looking at pedagogy, about training, about coercion and obedience, and about how one does or does not understand complex ideas like form. And that was what I was exploring, but with a fictitious persona. At that time, I was very interested in my work in having a stage persona that would often have a title or a name, and I would very loosely adhere to that persona. In that instance, it was a persona called Rosita Clavel, who was an equestrienne who had delusions of grandeur about her past, and her horse was called Mathematics. It is true that I have always been very interested in the Baroque. It's informed a lot of what my work has been. Baroque spectacle in terms of hippodramas and equestrian spectacle, as well as the origins of ballet resting in Baroque court spectacle. All those things have really informed my work. And it's a sort of insane extravagance that I sort of been really interested in exploring. But conversely, I'm also quite a minimalist in some of my work. My early monologues were very, very plain. It was just me, a microphone, and an audience. I suppose this panoply of elements that perhaps is something one would associate with the Baroque is something that I do love, almost like a sort of material fireworks, a display of elements, all in configuration with each other, which can only come together in the form of a live event. I do love that. yes.